Responsibility, I would just say, is what do I owe to other people.
Responsibility is being accountable for your actions.
I would say responsibility is doing moral good.
It's taking control of your actions and admitting that your actions are your own.
We could think about what we're responsible for because of our lifestyle. Where do we get our t-shirts from? Who makes them? And by buying them, do we share at least a little bit in responsibility for the working conditions? There was a factory that was really unsafe, and it collapsed, and it killed thousands of people. So now, it's important to keep perspective. It's not your personal responsibility that thousands of people died. More responsibility goes to the owner, who was maintaining this building in an unsafe way. But maybe we all had some small responsibility. What can we do about it?
I try to draw a general distinction between two kinds of responsibility, one that's kind of backward looking and one that's more forward looking. So here we're thinking back to those who created an act, and we're trying to locate where that harm comes from. It becomes a very complicated question because sometimes harms are caused by groups or indirectly by groups. So issues arise about whether responsibility is purely individual, whether it's shared, and so forth. That's one kind of backward-looking responsibility. Another would be if we're thinking about the people who have benefited from some harm and whether they have some kind of responsibility that's less direct because they didn't cause the harm, but they've benefited from it and allowed it to persist. So perhaps they have responsibility. And a third way of looking at this issue that's in a way backward-looking is if we look at people and say that they have the capacity to stop this harm, but they haven't carried it out, they haven't acted on that capacity. There again, you could say, well, they have a kind of responsibility if someone was being threatened by harm and they look the other way. Even if they didn't benefit from whatever harm was caused, we could say perhaps they're partially responsible. I think also there's a kind of forward-looking notion of responsibility that's worth thinking about. And this is what I have here is something that has less to do with holding people accountable for things that they didn't do or they did that shouldn't have been done or something of that sort, but rather people taking responsibility in the sense of looking at their world and deciding that they can act in some way that might change the world. So they take responsibility for making something new. I think it's good to think about responsibility in that way because it's not just a question of finding people guilty of causing harms or allowing harms to take place, but also imagining new ways of acting and new possibilities of taking responsibility for how our world works.
The concepts of responsibility, political violence, and justice are all part of our understanding of a larger value that is important in the contemporary world, and that's the value of democracy. I see these concepts as important to our everyday life as democratic citizens in a world in which democracy has become more important than it ever has been. The responsibilities that people have, I think, can fall into different categories, or there are different types of responsibilities that people may have. There are many folks who are active participants in democratic movements, in social movements. They take their responsibilities very seriously, and they're part of who they are as people. They're viewed as moral responsibilities. To be a moral person is to contribute actively to this process of democratic inclusion, democratic participation. And they view it as an unavoidable part of their lives. It's who they are. It's their moral responsibility. There's some folks, however, who have opted out in one way or another and sometimes have participated in public life and in other aspects of civil society in ways that obstruct the democratic process. And they sometimes do this in illegal ways. They sometimes do it in fairly subtle ways, but they're not morally committed to the democratic process. So the democratic process and the movements for democracy depend upon the moral responsibilities of many people, as they're felt by those folks individually, but they also depend upon the enforcement of legal responsibilities so that people don't obstruct other folks as they participate and demand their democratic rights. My own interest is in something different from both the moral responsibilities that are felt by individuals and groups and the legal responsibilities that are enforced upon people so that democracies can evolve and become more inclusive. That third category of responsibility I call political responsibility. This is something that we don't often think of as a responsibility. We think of it as possibly a right. If you want to participate in politics, you can, but you don't have to, right? It's not something that anybody feels we can demand of one another. My own view is that there is a political responsibility in two senses. I think there's a negative responsibility not to make it more difficult for others to participate in politics. I think there's a stronger, however, positive political responsibility to remedy obstruction, remedy obstacles, remedy disenfranchisement that's made it more difficult for people who've wanted to participate on an equal footing with one another to actually do that. I think some folks have seen something like this in our role within the economy. So as consumers, we're often told we have a responsibility not to purchase goods that have been made by people who are working in under substandard conditions. The sweatshop movement is a good example, and it appeals to us on a moral level. I would say something similar is true in politics, to the extent that we continue to, treat politics as simply one of many things that we could be interested in a society in which people don't have an equal opportunity to participate politically, or in a world in which people don't have an opportunity to participate equally, then we are like the consumer of sweatshop goods, sort of not meeting our responsibilities or obligations. So there's a parallel between the consumer responsibility not to purchase sweatshop goods and the political responsibility not to ignore the needs for opening up the political system to people who've been excluded by it against their will.
When people think about their role in either why things have happened in the past or how they might happen in the future, it then raises the question about how should the world look? How should have those things been done in the past? So they need some kind of standard or some kind of guide. We often use the concept of justice, even though that's just one way of thinking about it, but we can raise the question, did we act justly when we allowed segregation to continue or accepted a certain level of inequality? Was that just? So that raises a question about how we acted or how we should act in the future. So the idea of justice is one of the ideas that we can use for thinking about what was possible and what might be possible in the future. Now, internationally, it raises a lot of questions because we can think about why it is that there is the level of inequality that's going on in the world today. To what extent is that inequality something that could be avoided? Is it something on which we are capable of acting? as we raise those questions, we're really using the idea of responsibility to link us to questions about what's desirable and how we can act on those.
We benefit from a lavish lifestyle that's widely available in North America, not to everyone, but widely available. And partly that comes about because of unequal relations between our countries and other countries. And largely these can be trade relations. The fact is that the trade relations are very disadvantageous to many other countries. We benefit from that. We didn't do it. I didn't do it. You didn't do it, right? I'm not a trader. I don't own shares in Starbucks. And so, but still, do we have some responsibility? Well, I think we do. Because we are the beneficiaries of something that's unfair. And I think most people realize that that's not right. It's not right to benefit from something that's unfair. I think the reason for feeling responsible is different than the responsibility of someone who has actually committed a crime. It's a bit different, but it's still real. We're still benefiting from something that's unfair, and there are things that we can do about it. So we ask, we're not going to maybe beat ourselves up about it, but we're going to say, well, is there something we can do?
I think the most important thing for young people is to learn more, as a matter of fact. I think we become more responsible as we see the world as something we can make sense of and something that people can actually make a difference in the way that they act. So one way to make people more aware is to promote more knowledge in various ways. So for young people, I think it's crucial that they learn as much as they can, don't become discouraged, but also try to see what the experience of other people in their own cities is like, or even in their neighborhoods.
We can do a couple of things. We can look into what's called fair trade, okay? And this means that in order to sell things, a company has to show that they're not made under such bad conditions. And, we can also ask our clothing stores, where does this stuff come from? How is it made? We can also, there may be some opportunities for asking people in government or the clothing companies. You can send messages to clothing companies and to Nike and so on, and you can join in. And the thing is, it may not be always a good thing just to do this on your own, but keep your ears open, because there are campaigns. There are times when people are trying to get something done and they're well organized, and what they need is one more signature from you. So it's just good to keep your ears and eyes open for opportunities like that. And that would be, exercising your responsibility. You're being a really responsible person just by being alert to those opportunities.
I think our own educational system in a democracy like the United States addresses some of these problems some of the time. We talk about morality. We recognize that there are fundamental ways in which morality should be part of our education system. And we think any moral person should respect the freedom of speech and the sort of freedom of movement and other individual freedoms that we have. The role of political education is more complicated, and how one sort of addresses the need for a political education in a democratic society requires a little more thought. It goes beyond simply the respect that we give to one another as free and equal individuals. It has to do with an understanding of the way in which people live their lives in groups. Our choices are often the product of group relationships, identities that are formed within groups, and the goals and ambitions of the groups that we live in. So the goal for a democratic political education that highlights our responsibilities to one another would be one that doesn't simply stress the values of individual liberty and individual and equality among individuals, but would also stress the contextual, the context within which we make our decisions and we live our lives. And as I've tried to suggest, that context is one of group membership and group power dynamics.